pleasure to be here with you both, and all of you. From Constantine to the Capitol, from the Roman eagle to the American flag, Christians have always been tempted to believe that God loves their nation best. In the 4th century, when Constantine saw a cross in the sky and heard the words, "In this sign, conquer," the church went from being a persecuted minority to the empire's moral compass and its handmaiden. That's the beginning of what we now call Christendom, when Christianity stopped being a story about a crucified God and started becoming a story about divine power, protection, and victory. Ever since, every Christian nation has had its own version of that moment. The English saw themselves as defenders of the true faith. The Germans thought that the Reformation was a national awakening. The Puritans came to New England, believing that they were building a new Israel, a city on a hill. And Americans have spent centuries believing that their republic is somehow God's chosen vessel. But here's the question. What happens when that belief curdles? What when faith becomes a badge of belonging instead of a call to repentance? When Christianity becomes less about the Sermon on the Mount and more about defending our way of life? Tonight, we invite you to a conversation about Christian nationalisms, not as a new problem, but as an old story with new consequences. It's the story of faith and flag, of gospel and glory, and of the uneasy marriage between the cross and the nation state. I present to you Scott Jones and Bill Borror.
Thank you, Mark. I think we should just take up an offering right there. That was good, Mark. That was good. Just any questions?
Bill wrote that and handed it to me.
Well, actually, Scott handed it to me.
I did. I got it right from ChatGPT. Fantastic.
Anyway, so again, we're almost obsolete already. Well, thank you all for coming out.
Speak for yourself.
All right.
Jeez
I was actually had you in mind, but we
at least Scott knows how to get the GPT to do the
that's
thing.
right.
So,
That's more than something.
I don't know who we want to call, who we want to be pointing fingers at as being.
Yeah.
I've got like the best AI. Okay, fantastic, very powerful. I typed it in powerfully and strongly. Okay.
For those,
It's a beautiful thing.
right.
Beautiful. Like people are saying. Okay. What they're saying out there, like this is what people say, okay, that I put in like the most strong AI prompts, like it's fantastic, okay, and I don't use an illegal AI, okay, it's fully American, fantastic. We want no Chinese chips.
So we really owe a lot to Donald Trump for our podcast because his story has run parallel with our stories as a politician. We started podcasting in the fall of 2015. And so this is our 382nd podcast. So welcome to Vermont.
But this is the coldest it's been that I remember, I think.
Yeah, we wanted
on
you
record.
we wanted you to come up during the springtime up here.
It's
So
balmy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
balmy. So we have talked about the subject a good bit, and one of the things that we think is kind of important about this issue because there's a lot of emotion around it. There's a lot of reaction to it, and there's significant support for it as well. And after our most recent discussion of this subject, someone said we need to talk about it more. So we thought Vermont would be a.
Which we thought, how would this be? We thought we had said everything we
said
could on the subject.
And we probably have, but we're glad you're here through the snow to do it. So one of the things I think for me, as we want there to be an opportunity for you to make comments and ask questions. Rabbi Michael Cohen has graciously agreed to be a respondent. He says, I don't really know anything about this topic. And I said, you've been dealing with crazy Christians your entire life, so you're an expert, right? But
And crazy Jews. They're kind of
I thought that's a different podcast. That's something. But that's a whole series, right? That's a series of like. But one of the things I think is to understand that there's not one kind of Christian nationalism. Matter of fact, if there's a certain kind that you're troubled by, it's partially because you have an alternative vision of what you think it should be, right? And so I think sometimes with Christian nationalism, we have to think about it can be a theological movement, and when we think of the current version of that, I think of your good friend Doug Wilson, and
Look, I only have good friends that go to his church.
all right, Moscow,
I have the
and
pleasure
Moscow,
of
I don't,
knowing
but
Doug, yeah.
but this is a theological program. It's a different version of what the Puritans were trying to do. Those of us who are UCC are forefathers and mothers in the faith. And so
I think the Puritans would look at Doug and say, "You need to relax."
I think they would need to. Doug, if you don't know who Doug Wilson is, he's a very prominent proponent of. They used to call it the Reconstructionist movement. Do they still call it that? But it's an idea that America should actually be something like a theocracy. That's ultimately we will usher in the kingdom of God when that happens. And he's not. He's an educated man. He used to travel with Christopher Hitchens and have debates. He was friends with Christopher Hitchens, so he's a thoughtful person with some very very strong problematic theological ideas, at least from my perspective. That's theological Christian nationalism. There's a cultural Christian nationalism. The late great senator from Vermont, Senator Flanders, in 1952, proposed adding Christ as King and Lord in the Constitution. Okay. He was not a fire-breathing right-wing person at all. He was a traditionalist. The National Council of Evangelicals a few years earlier tried to get a constitutional amendment saying in the Constitution, not amendment, but putting the words Jesus Christ is Lord and we honor him as King alone, something like that, right? Neither of those things happened, but we did get In God We Trust in our money. And Dwight Eisenhower, who joined the Presbyterian Church a couple months before he became president, said this thing only works, America only works if there's faith. But he didn't really say which faith it should be. And for him, I think it was kind of a generic Christian faith. So there's a cultural Christian nationalism. It mentioned the T.S. Eliot stuff. I think T.S. Eliot sees it as grounded in Western civilization, which you've been reading a lot of T.S. Eliot lately.
Yes. I just try to skip over the anti-Semitic parts, which,
Right.
which leads to reading quickly.
Reading
some
quickly,
of the
yeah.
early stuff. But
He was a marvelous
Makes me
mind.
speed read,
He was a
actually, yeah.
marvelous mind with some really dark corners in that mind. So how would you, you and I talked.
Actually, Bill, I thought that was somebody asked me about you. I said it's the same thing. marvelous man with a lot of dark corners.
Well, yes, that's true. That's why you married me, right? Yeah, there we go. But talk about like when Eliot will say that really in the West, if you're an atheist, you're a Christian atheist. Explain to us what that is, Scott.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because we did a podcast last year or something on something I had reread in a footnote in T.S. Eliot, where it was a collection of ecumenical essays, and he wrote this essay on the concept of revelation, and it's a little opaque at points, but he has a footnote at the end, and he says that when we find an idea that's repugnant, that we should ask ourselves why it's repugnant and try to understand it and before we just reject it. And he says, there's a great quote, and then he says, this is why when reading Augustine, we ought not to immediately dismiss the repugnancy of infant damnation. Now, see, that's how I like my Christianity. There's no room for infant damnation. I mean, we're going too light on people, right? I mean, you gotta crack the whip once in a while, right? I mean, if they're not afraid they're going to hell, okay, at least when they're kids in the terrible twos, you could, do something like that.
By the way, Tim, you asked what we believe here. We don't believe that. All right, go ahead.
Your loss. Your loss.
Well,
One of these great things.
We like our Augustine. I like my Augustine in the middle before he got very dark. You like your late Augustine.
Yeah, I call that the good old days.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I return to T.S. Eliot now and again. And the anti-Semitic parts it's ironic because the last book I just reread on Eliot, Skepticism and Modern Enmity, is by Jeffrey Pearl, who's his Jewish scholar who teaches in Israel. And this guy is just an elegant scholar. But Eliot thinks that cultures are not a-religious, right? That they'll just have religious animating spirits. And he looks at Stalinism, right, as the exception that proves the rule. He's like, well, what do you have in Stalinism? You have state religion, right? You'll just have these things that look liturgical. And if you try to evacuate them of theology, you'll see it's just, it's truth with a capital T in austere atheist, but it's not austere, right? It's august. I mean, it's the boots and the. I mean, there's one thing you've got to like about fascism. It's the fashion sense, right? If you, I don't know where you find time to oppress people with all the fittings, right? Like a guy like Gaddafi, there's just got to be fittings all day, right? I mean, this is
a lot of uniforms, a lot of medals.
Yeah,
got a lot of the medals.
This is why Kim Jong-un must be more efficient, right? You just, it's one outfit the whole time,
right?
the whole time,
Yeah.
the whole time. Yeah. But so Eliot sort of thinks that he's written a lot. He wrote a lot over his career on the concept of Christian culture, but his Christianity was a pluralistic culture, right? And he says these provocative things that he's like, well, you can have Muslims or Jews or atheists, but there'll be Christian Muslims, Christian Jews, Christian atheists. Now that's not that he didn't mean by that they wouldn't be theologically outside the Christian tradition. He meant that they would sort of be representative of a wider cultural consensus. They'd be part of a consensus that was noticeably Christian. Now that sounds so imperialistic when you and I get it, but when you think about just one example that I can think of today, right? Look at England and France. Now England is an officially Christian country in many ways, right? I mean, the prime minister appoints the head of the church, right? Through the authority of the king, and yet if you are a Jew or Muslim, you've got more religious liberty for expression than you do in France, which is secular, right? Where a lot of times religious expression is explicitly in places like public schools forbidden, right? And so these kinds of, so as Bill said, like the Christian nationalism, all these sorts of things aren't created equally, right?
Right, and you could also say a lot of the culture wars in this country, which we've talked a lot about, are various emphases within Christianity. Okay, and so there's a sense where some of the deepest held liberal, classic liberal values are really rooted in not the Enlightenment, but rooted in medieval thought as Christianity was becoming more global, and in a lot of ways, the peak of, if you would, mainline progressive Christianity was very much a marriage with Jewish thinkers and this idea that real Christianity was going to evolve to be something that was universal, and that we all would be in one church, and we all would, there'd be one Protestant church, and America, this 20th century was the Christian century, and that we were all evolving and progressing to a particular vision that was very white and very, 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 very male. A lot of these things were very male, but progressive, and
we love the white males.
We love the white male.
I do very well with the white male.
Which is kind of ironic too, where and of course that peaked probably 1965, something like that, when church attendance in America was at its all-time highest in its entire history. It was significantly more people in church in 1965 than there was in 1765. Probably less than 10% of people went to church prior to the Great Awakening during the Revolutionary period. A third one, and then the third kind of category, and I'm sure there are more, but for our purposes, is identity Christianity, and that has a long and somewhat nefarious tradition in this country and other places as well. but this idea of Christianity almost as a tribalism. Okay, and so and if you really, it's really what the conflict in Northern Ireland was. It was not Protestant Catholic. It was two tribal groups with long histories. That religion was just part of it. But the Know Nothing Party, for instance, was anti-immigrant, which meant it was anti-Catholic, and then it became anti-Jewish later on. But that immigration hadn't happened yet. A lot of the immigration laws that were passed, with great tragic consequences, once Hitler took power, were really kind of a xenophobic fear of watering down white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, and that there was those sentiments on both the left and right. But probably the darkest groups were the groups that were aligned with racial identity. Those groups that actually were infiltrated by the Nazis in the 30s. The original Make America Great Again movement was really Make America White and Christian, Protestant Christian, and so there is this kind of white, sometimes what's called now white Christian nationalism. It's convoluted by putting all those things together, because it was always a very small minority movement, but that those ideas were born, probably the ideas that are in the air now have their roots in the 30s. And you can draw direct lines to some of those things where it really is not Christianity in a creedal way. For instance, there are a lot, Christianity has become, in certain segments, more tribal. We want to make America a Christian nation again. And there are a lot of those people who never go to church. So it's become it's again, if you were involved, I spent some time in Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Peace Accord, and it was really very apparent, and they were self-understanding, the Protestant Catholics who were trying to make peace said, we need to get beyond this tribalism. It's not about Jesus, and actually there were very brave priests, very brave Presbyterian and Methodist and folks who were trying to bridge those gaps in Northern Ireland, and they were part of what brought about the peace. So that third category is Christian nationalism as just as a tribal identity. To be Christian and to be American is to be Christian, and that may have very little to do with Bible or anything confessional, but it's an identity politics. So it's that's that group's version of the identity politics that is part of the balkanization right now of American public life.
Yeah, I want to say two things quickly, but I think the first thing will just be descriptive. So there's a 2022 Pew poll that gets cited a lot still. It's very interesting. When they asked people, the headline of the poll a couple years ago was 45% of Americans say the U.S. should be a Christian nation. 45%. Look, some of you guys. I'm just saying. I mean, the odds were rolling the dice if the poll's right. So then you dig into the polling, right? And 60% to 37%, 60% say that the founders originally intended the country to be a Christian nation. When you go down, so should we be a Christian nation now, it drops to 45%. Do you think the U.S. is now a Christian nation? It drops to 33%. So it breaks 64% no, 33% yes. Now, this is really interesting. So 4 in 10, or almost 5 in 10, right? 4.5, right? It's like 2.5 kids, 4.5, right? You want the 2.5 kids, right? God forbid the kid is the half, right? It's a kid that goes to film school. So what we love the filming. Filming is fantastic.
We want to thank Jeanette for being here tonight.
She's a great filmer, all right? Fantastic filmer.
I just remember the guy who doesn't live in Vermont is saying this stuff
exactly.
right now.
Exactly.
All right, go ahead.
So then you ask, should Supreme Court justices bring their own religious views into how they decide cases? 15% say yes, right? So 45% said we should be a Christian nation. It drops to 15%. 83% say no, I don't want judges doing this. Should churches or other houses of worship endorse political candidates, right? I mean, come on, 20%. 20% want their churches or synagogues endorsing candidates. 20%, 77% say no. Should churches or other houses of worship, 31%, now I'd have to dig into how this, 31% of people polled said they should express views on day-to-day social and political questions. 67% of folks in this poll said that churches, synagogues, mosques should keep out of political matters, right? Now that's interesting, right? Because I think on the right and the left, you would get a lot of pushback from that, right? Whether you're the Pat Robertsons or whether you're the religious left, it's very interesting. There's a very provocative book written in the early 90s called Resident Aliens by two Christians, Stanley Hauerwas and Will Willimon. And they were it was to mainline Protestants calling for mainline Protestants to be more distinctively Christian, right? To stop trying to be the chaplain of the culture and try to be more of an alternative community. And in the beginning, the first chapter of that book, they say, now this is something, right? I mean, these are the kind of things Bill says, right? I don't say provocative things like this, but they say, that Jerry Falwell and Jesse Jackson are just two different visions of the desire to have a Christian America. Now, that's really interesting, right?
Yeah,
Because if you're on one side or the other of the spectrum, you think, well, this is, okay, Martin Luther King, that kind of, vision for a religious side, okay, but Falwell, not so much. So the polling there is pretty interesting. You also, they ask, among the 45%, right? So among the, four of you, among the 45%, they say, do you want the federal government to officially declare the nation Christian? I don't know what that would look like. Right?
Those constitutional things that they're trying to
do we had Trump come out, all right, we're a Christian nation now, Bobby Kennedy now, and let's get to celebrate, we'll do like a pull-up contest, all right, the big Christian boys. So 20% say they have no opinion, or that they just don't want to. 52% of the 45% that say, yeah, we want a Christian nation, 52% say they think that the federal government should never declare any particular religion as the official religion of the United States, right? So this is like the people, right, where you say, do you think the United States spends too much on foreign aid? They say yes, but do you think we should cut it? No, right? I mean, these are the kind of questions you get in polls. But 52% don't think the federal government should advocate for any moral values, right? 39% want a complete separation of church and state, as opposed to only 31% of people that want to stop it. So among that 45%, think about this, in the four and a half of the people, 39% of them want a strict enforcement of separation of church and state. 31% want the ceasing of enforcing of the separation. So this is where I think you get some schizophrenic stuff, right? And I think that's because we're confused. Because I think where Eliot has been instructive to me on this, and I think, he's not the only thinker that would say things like this, but I do think that one of the problems of Enlightenment liberalism is it's a negative concept, right? Negative in the sense of, Christians have been really good in history at killing each other. It's like one of our specialties, right? We kill the most. We're fantastic at killing people. We're like the best religion, okay? Better than the Muslims. But after you kill each other in Europe for a while, you just say, well, what if we had pluralism, right? 30 years of war is a lot, right? Even if we don't like you, it's just, not good economics.
All right, can I say, so we got really good at killing each other once we divided.
Right, exactly,
right.
Exactly.
So that was the 30-year war he was referring to.
Right, so you get over time the concept of secular liberalism, right? That, okay, we ought to have pluralistic spaces and do better post-Enlightenment with a sort of more secular space in public life. which I think does make for a more peaceful and pluralistic life. The problem is when you ask what is liberalism, right? What is liberal society? Is it just negative freedoms? Is it just freedom from? What about freedom for? Like, what is liberalism free for? And the worst forms of liberalism, and its critics will say, well, liberalism is freedom to sort of just pursue your own ends, right? Capitalism, consumerism, maybe, if you're pious, crystals or yoga or meditation or something, right? But, in the words of Stanley Hauerwas, who's depending on Alistair McIntyre here, and if you ever heard Hauerwas, he's kind of this high, whiny text, and he says, the problem with capitalism is it just makes really shitty people. And that would be the critique of liberalism, right? That it's vacuous, that ultimately you get all this freedom to just pursue your own private Idaho, right? And that ultimately we need more than that. So I think some of this idea about, all right, we need a Christian nation again, is that people want some sense of positive values, right? And some sort of spiritually animating force. But then when you start to ask them, okay, so Christian, so Supreme Court justice, oh, no, maybe a chaplain praying for the Senate, but no, we don't want a theocracy. So we're of a sort of divided mind here. But one other thing I'll just add from Eliot that I recently read that I found particularly instructive. Eliot thinks that what happens in what he calls higher religion, he says, you start with sort of more primitive religion as religions evolving in early humanity. And their religion is sort of inseparable from the culture, right? I mean, you're just sort of religion, cult, the whole thing, who runs the tribe. It's all just one thing. And he thinks higher religions, basically means Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, world religious traditions, have this capacity to stand above the culture to some degree, to transcend it and to say no to it at times, right? We think of the civil rights movement where King and Heschel are able to powerfully invoke things in the culture and then turn it against the darker, sort of shadows of the culture. And then he says this about totalitarianism, which I think is just fascinating and brilliant. He said, totalitarianism appeals to the desire to return to the womb. The contrast between religion and culture imposes a strain, right? Because you go, oh my gosh, I'm just getting tired of all this moral thinking. I just want to relax. We escape from this strain by attempting to revert to an identity of religion and culture which prevailed at a more primitive stage. As when we indulge in alcohol as an anodyne, we consciously seek unconsciousness. All right, well, sometimes you see an election and you think, wow, I give you the best unconsciousness. It's fantastic. It is only by unremitting effort that we can persist in being individuals in a society instead of merely members of a disciplined crowd. Yet we remain members of the crowd even when we succeed in being individuals. Hence, for the purpose of this essay, I'm obliged to maintain two contradictory propositions: that religion and culture are aspects of one unity, and that they are two different and contrasted things. So I think this is the part of the problem, right? Because I think in my sort of there are moments where I look at people like Doug Wilson and I think the problem over here in Moscow, Idaho, is maybe this guy does have a point, right? That we do need shared symbols, we do need shared stories, we do need a concept to say, hey, liberal society shouldn't just be about freedom from, it should be about freedom for. It should actually help. We should actually help make the citizenry a more loving people.
Well, I think, what do we have to bind us to one another?
Yes,
right,
yes.
right, yeah.
And this gives us something to bind to. The problem is that it's heresy, right?
Well, and the interesting thing is, to that point, everybody, it doesn't matter if you're Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama, talk about us being a city on the hill. That's the only phrase they read in that sermon, right? Because it's a fairly, if you read the whole sermon, it's a very, I don't think he would have been happy the way things worked out. He wasn't happy the way things, that's why they all moved to Connecticut, right? Because of, it didn't quite happen in Massachusetts Bay, but this ideal, this American
Where do
conception-
Vermont people go when they're not happy?
We got
it's not
kicked-
Connecticut,
no,
or
we
is
got
it
kicked out of Vermont.
Oh, okay.
People got kicked out of Connecticut came to Vermont. That's kind of how it went down. Not quite. But, so I think that's the interesting thing, because that's this idea of we want to be the city on the hill.
Right.
We want that, but, yeah, it's maybe something that's really problematic from a faith perspective.
And there is something, Bill and I were talking the other day, and I send Bill these. Bill also jokes that when we talk on the phone, I don't do salutations.
You know.
Like there's no hello, Bill, how are you, shalom, nothing. I just go, Bill, did you read this thing? And what do you think? I just say,
Sometimes there's not a subject or a predicate.
I just go in. Sometimes it's an adverb, like powerfully, strongly. But, I just lost my train of thought.
You were talking to me the other day.
Oh, yeah, I was talking about liberalism. I said, we were talking about, I was reading something about, Bill sent me something about the religious left. I said, the problem with the left and religion is it's always instrumental. Right? It's always publicly used to, Jesus would say, support the welfare program. Or this, I've read, the Torah, and it says, welcome the stranger. But there's no talk of just like, hey, prayer is really just good for your soul. It makes you like, less of a shitty person. It's always, with the exception, I'll tell you, notable exception is my governor, Josh Shapiro. And if you've seen him on Colbert talking about faith, he talks about it in a way that it's not just instrumental to, and when he was talking about
Stephen Colbert talks that way.
Colbert's another one. Yeah, the Colbert and Shapiro, when they're talking, it's like here are two guys on the left that the faith is not just invoked for a policy program, but it's actually you see that it serves personal formation. And I think there's something of a desire or recognition, I think, in some people. And I find this, I have a good friend who's a rabbi in northern Jersey. We talk about this all the time, that you couldn't do what King at Heschel did without civil religion, right? That these guys could invoke the Hebrew Bible and Jefferson and Adams and Lincoln with basically a secular scripture, and you could sort of you could call on people's better angels because you thought this is not. It wasn't a sort of saying America's awful and it's this project that's failed. It was saying we actually aren't living into our best angels and our best parts of the tradition. And that's what I think some sort of more religiosity, which I think probably would be inclusive, but probably has to have some sort of Christian spirit to it because it's the majority.
And I also think that happened on the tail end of the shared experience of World War II. You looked into the eyes of what the devil could do, and then you also saw what was happening when we really found out what was going on in Soviet Russia. The romanticism of Marxism in the 1920s, then we started finding out what was really going on. So there's this kind of, we defeated fascism, okay, aggressive atheistic communism is in our face. So I think there was an opportunity for commonality and self-reflection.
Communism that also affects how American identity is being reborn out of that war.
Right.
Because American identity is being born anew in some ways, right then and there.
And I also think people that were school teachers from Vermont and sharecroppers from Mississippi and factory workers from Ohio and farmers, ranchers from Wyoming all wore the same uniform. And there was a commonality, and we this is what hate can do. And I think there was an opportunity for some self-reflection. Where's hate in our society as well? I think that was part. I think the civil rights movement was born out of a lot of things, but the hypocrisy of of post Reconstructionist America, and seeing what prejudice and hate did in Europe, I think, and people who risked their lives and were fighting along people different from them. I think that was part of the soil that allowed our best better angels, the best of civil religion and Christianity and Judaism and Unitarian, and humanism to come together in a way that was unique for that time. And that may be historically you know, I don't have a crystal ball. That may have been when we peaked. And we 1965 or 60, and even 65 happened because of a political assassination, right? So I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about our history from that way. But you know, one of the things I do think that it's helpful with the statistics you read is you can see. I think one of my hopes is that we're just a little more precise in what we criticize, maybe a little more precise in what we embrace, but also a little more precise in what we react to, because I think we see things that are clearly hateful in our society that's under the guise of Christianity, but then we also see this longing for something that may be utopian, may not even be good for Christianity. It's funny. I tell Laura and I, we have to have this conversation. It's actually good for us spiritually that we as mainline churches are in decline. It's good that we're not popular anymore. It's good that it's not you join the Rotary and join the church. That people who come here on Sunday are here because they want to be here, because they are looking for spiritual nurture. They're committed to some of the social principles that have always been part of this. But people choose to come here because they're committed to this community. They want to grow in their faith. They want to love their neighbor. They want to make a difference in the world. But it's not. I don't come here because it's a social convention. And I think that as a pastor, that's a much healthier. It's a much healthier field to be working in. Again, I think it's bad, not good for the country, but I think it's good for Christianity in some ways, which I think that's paradoxical. But is that my latent Anabaptistism coming through there a little bit?
I don't know. That's late. I mean, that's, I'm a divided mind on this, right? On some level, I live a pretty secular life. I mean, look, I skip the sermon every week and just take the Eucharist. I mean, this is.
Well, that's because you don't come to my church.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's too cold here. You wouldn't see me. You'd see me even less with this weather. Oh, gosh, I'd be watching Joel Osteen or something. Okay. No, but I mean.
Can you erase that part right there?
Yeah. I remember watching that guy, and he's like, I'm out with my family, and we're just looking for a parking spot, and I couldn't find one, and I thought, Lord, you're gonna ruin family day, and I prayed, and I pulled around, and there was a spot. I thought, I've prayed that prayer so many damn times. What's wrong with me? Well, it's because I'm still going late. This is why.
That also is a different podcast. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, it's many. It could be a whole other segment. No, but because I do think you're right about this. There's something about what about the sort of this post-millennial city on a hill thing that I like, right? That I think, I think it would be great if we had a sort of religious leavening in the country, right? If we had this capacity. But then what I worry about is what you're saying is Eliot has this great thing about the higher religion, that this great thing about religious evolution is it can step back from the culture, right? Like a therapy session, like a tough psychoanalyst, and say things are not great here, right? And I think what I see in some of the Christian nationalists. By the way, I do an interview show, and I'm having a Christian nationalist back on the show. I mean, I don't think he's a racist or anything, but he's a guy that actually knew Charlie Kirk pretty well, and was he was the former board president of Turning Point, and so I'm having him on the show because I want to do a show about the conservative Civil War and Nick Fuentes and all that stuff. And I'm not on the inside of this stuff, right? And but what I worry about when I talk with a guy like this a little bit is exactly what Eliot's talking about. The anodyne alcohol use, right? To sort of like what I think Donald Trump promises is a fusion back, right? Is a sort of look. Is this sort of where Christian will become an ethnic identity? That's something you just sort of that I'm a Christian because I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Muslim. I mean, I'm not a woke-ass liberal. I'm not, or any of these things. And that's what I check, right? And that identitarianism doesn't allow for exactly the sort of moral or spiritual insight. And it doesn't involve any personal spiritual development, right? I mean, this is, it doesn't enable you to experience the grace of God and to heal your own story, right? And or that sort of stuff. It's a sort of easy acceptance of some of the worst parts of ourselves.
Yeah, it's not about grace, yeah.
Yeah.
If you want to say, then I want to invite Michael up and then give you all some time to share as well. Did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say to that no, I mean, I've lost my thought, but in nationalism, the problem with nationalism is that it's about defining the boundaries of who is in and who is not, right? And so when you say Christian nationalism now, we all have to be Christian of some kind, and it really ends up being that kind of identitarianism, kind of Christianity. Mac Lofton, writing in the Christian Century, calls it a blasphemy, not of Christian nationalism, but of national Christianity.
Yeah.
And because the other thing that it doesn't give you is it doesn't connect you to the wider body of Christ.
Right. It's kind of, it's like
because there's no concern or care for or feeling of kindredness with a Christian in Palestine or a Christian in Ukraine or a Christian in
It's really what Napoleon allowed after. Said you can be a Jew, but you have to be a French Jew, right? You can be a Catholic, but you have to be a French Catholic. So, all right, Michael, I'll invite you up here. Yeah.
Thanks. Can we, being Jewish, I need to use my hands. So,
Do you want to?
Yeah, can I have
here
that?
you go. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. In other cultures, I know they also need both hands, so don't want to be too ethnocentric here. So first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. You've touched on a lot, so I'm going to try to touch on some of it. Allison always reminds me when I get excited, I talk fast. So if I get excited and talk fast, please someone tell me to slow down.
Allison, that's why you're here.
Yeah, yes. Christian Reconstructionists. So I'm from the Reconstructionist movement in Judaism. So that was like, wow. Very, very different.
These are like the opposite.
Totally opposite.
It's the opposite.
So Mordechai Kaplan, who founded the Reconstructionist Jewish movement, got rid of chosenness, got rid of a supernatural God. So it's a very, very same word, but completely different meaning, which is fascinating. I want to talk two big picture ideas. One is not just about Christian nationalism, but why too often do we see in world history religions going overboard? And I think one way of answering or looking at that is to think about the Lord Acton quote about power. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if we posit that God is the absolute power in the world, and if you think you know what the absolute power in the world wants, that can be very corrupting. I would argue all religions have the check against that, but when that check is weakened, as we see today, we see what religions can become. They become monsters. But it's this being drunk on this understanding what the absolute power in the world is, because it also gives you a sense of identity.
Right.
It's a positive thing that I don't want to completely negate, but we need to understand that dynamic of God is the absolute power, and if you can touch it. Identity, wow. I mean, identity is so important to being a human being. It's how we make sense of the world. For many of us, it's how we find safety through our identity and the prisms of how we see the world. So if you feel your identity is being challenged, even if that's a false narrative, but people feel that, you also then feel unsafe. And I think we have to have a little rahmanas, a little mercy on people who are acting in a way that we don't like because they see their identity being challenged. They don't feel unsafe. They don't feel safe. And we need to understand that dynamic and try to meet them there. I mean, the truth be told is change is the constant of the world and of life and of everything. And it's getting people to understand that change is the real constant and to be comfortable with it. So the final point I want to make is Allison and I just got back from being away for a month. We were 10 days in the Holy Land visiting our son and grandson and daughter-in-law, which was wonderful, and all the complexities there, which we can do in another podcast. But we ended up in Rome for 10 days because as we go, as you know, back and forth to the Aravai Institute in Israel, where we bring together Israelis and Palestinians the last 30 years. Europe's in the way darn, so we always stop off in Europe. So we did 10 days in Rome, and we ended up with 2 meetings at the Vatican. Because we have grown at Kibbutz Keturah a date tree from a seed that came from a tree from the time of Jesus. We call the tree Methuselah, and my dream has always been to get a palm frond from that tree to the Pope for a Palm Sunday. So that led to 2 meetings at the Vatican, which were amazingly successful, and we'll see where that all goes. But Allison and I then got invited to the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, 1965 again. Right? When Vatican II, after John the 23rd, and then Pope Paul VI, when Catholicism recognized that they needed to look at non-Christians in a very different way. And the main focus was on Judaism, but it was about all other religions. So Allison and I were there for this amazing celebration with religious leaders from all over the world. They had us sitting there separately by each of our religions, which I thought was a little weird for an interfaith event. And I didn't know any of the Jews, but I looked over there, and there was a Muslim woman I knew, Menaz Afrati, who teaches actually Holocaust studies at Manhattan College and does amazing interfaith work, but that was just kind of breaking down those barriers. But I want to quote from what Pope Leo XIV said at this event. "Dialogue is not a tactic or a tool, but a way of life. A journey of the heart that transforms everyone involved, the one who listens and the one who speaks." And then he went on in that speech, actually it was two weeks ago tonight, it was a Tuesday night. Yet today we find ourselves in a world where that vision is often obscure, where we're not united anymore. We see walls rising again between nations, between religions, even between neighbors. The noise of conflict, the wounds of poverty, and the cry of the earth remind us how fragile our human family remains. Many have grown weary of promises. Many have forgotten how to hope. And he called this speech Walking Together in Hope. And so we have the antithesis of that within religion as well. And so it's interesting that our Pope Leo, our American Pope, Chicago White Sox fan, brings us this wisdom. And in terms of this larger conversation, there are those other voices within religion, religious leaders, who are saying we need to do this differently. So that's all I got
And
to
that
say.
was, today in our men's Bible study, Romans 8, hope it's not seen. Yeah, right, so that's good. Thank you very much. I'll invite you back, and we want to give the rest, and if you have to leave, fine. But we want to give the opportunity for you to have comments or questions, and we'll respond, or we're happy just to, we'll talk all night. That's part of our problem, but and our gift, right? So, any thoughts or comments, or?
I've always thought of liberalism as being aspirational.
Right.
That we're not happy or with the status quo. We always want to make things better. We see where there are needs, whether it be poverty or inequality or income inequality, et cetera. And so I think, thinking about liberalism, that's where I kind of come from. But I do agree that some of the comments made tonight, that there's some negativity, and we have to push the positiveness. And I think that's part of our challenge when we're faced with something like Christian nationalism, when we're so rigid and telling us this, you have to be in lockstep with us, otherwise you are out on the fringes. So I throw that out as a comment.
Well, and I would say what you just said there is very, very much in the heart of the Judeo-Christian, not tradition, but the book, and the teachings of our faith, right? Part of and part of the problem is terms, right? Because those are kind of liberal sentiments. I would call them gospel sentiments. And part of the problem and we've talked a lot about this, is
But can we just qualify too? When we say liberal, there's
that's what we
Yeah, I
need
was
to
just gonna
say.
say, yeah.
But go ahead and define
Yeah,
it.
so on one level, right? David French is somewhat of a friend of mine. He comes on my other podcast a little bit, but David French and I are both classical liberals, right? In the Enlightenment sense, right? It's small L, in that Jeffersonian Declaration. We stand in a tradition that says we believe in a republican government. We believe the individual is sort of sovereign, and the individual should have inviolable rights that inalienable, given to us by the Creator or however the God of nature, however you see that, and that within that sovereignty shouldn't be transcended. That it doesn't matter if courts get together and say we want 80% of the population wants such an interracial marriage illegal. We can't do that. It's an inviolable right. So we're all, David French and I are both, now I'm a liberal in the sense of I like the government doing things like healthcare. David thinks the government doesn't do anything but screw that stuff up, right? So we're both classical liberals, but then we both have illiberals in our own camps, right? So we have illiberal folks on the right, right? Some of the Christian nationalist folks and the tribal folks. And there are illiberal folks on the left. I mean, we've seen this in many of the protest movements since October 7th. I mean, the voices that are not classical, they are with me on healthcare and some other things, but they are not with me on free speech and certain things in the Enlightenment tradition, right? So when I was pushing back on the deficiencies of liberalism, I'm talking about liberalism small l, not liberalism sort of Bernie Sanders and get the millionaires and billionaires.
No,
By the way, I love your senator.
And
I like Bernie.
but also, I think the problem theologically is, for instance, Dorothy Day, the great Catholic worker, she was a socialist politically and a pre-Vatican II conservative in a Roman Catholicism, right? And that actually is ideologically sound from her perspective. Part of the problem with American liberal
So Bill, I can be a socialist and still believe in an infant damnation, or no?
yeah, you and Dorothy Day together
All
on
right,
that.
just checking.
Yeah, right. All right. That Bonaventure changed that, so you don't have that. That was modified in the Middle Ages, but I do think that part of what are the underlying metaphysics, or what are the underlying there. So when we, for instance, that is part of the problem, I think, in a kind of liberalism that says that things that we believe to be the case, like I use this as an example. We hold these truths to be evident that all people are created equal. Okay, that is not a self-evident truth from either biology or from evolution. I believe it because it's a revealed idea. I believe that all people are created equal because I believe that God, in the eyes of God, God loves us all equally, and that our source comes from God. But if you don't have what is your underlying metaphysics to believe in the inherent equality of all people, that becomes problematic if with the changing of that's part of the postmodern problem. That's part of the rejection of Enlightenment values, because the Enlightenment said, yeah, these are self-evident. These are self-evident, the laws of nature, the laws of nature's God. But the postmodern moment is, well, no, we're not, we don't believe in self-evident truth.
And the Enlightenment says that it's self-evident after being soaked for centuries in the Hebrew Bible and Plato and Aristotle.
Exactly.
Right?
No.
So the self-evidence helps a little with your reading list.
Right. So in other words, even though their Christianity was very different, it was still, that part of the Western liberal tradition was very Christian, right, in the best sense of it, right? So I think that's part of, it's complicated with these terms, right? And it's my own life experience has been one of kind of being an equal opportunity offender, because I kind of find myself very sympathetic about making a difference in the world for good and the inherent justice and equality of everyone. But it's rooted for me in my Orthodox Christian faith, right? So, anyway.
Anyone else? We've left them speechless, Bill.
That's right. Felt good. Mark, would you like to have a final word? Or any word? Does that have to
Any
be-
word?
Any word you want to, yeah.
I don't have any word. Christian nationalism is bad? Is that what are we concluding that? Or
Well,
are we,
I guess for me, you have to break it. So what are you,
yeah.
so in other words, the problem with making a blank statement like that would be, because I think a lot of us in this room would want to have a culture of respecting, loving your neighbor, of caring for the weak and the poor. In other words, these Christian virtues. We want the vision of Martin Luther King and the hopeful parts of Ronald Reagan too. We want that commonality. We want this idea, some of these values that for those of us who are Christian or Jewish are rooted in our faith. So that's part of some of the things we very critique about, let's say, white Christian nationalism or identity politics nationalism, we critique from our own Christian convictions.
Right.
And so that's where I think precision in this discussion is, and also recognizing the things that people, I think Michael's point, where are the insecurities? What are people afraid of? I mean, the fact of the matter is, on one level, I find it as a pastor, I'm not particularly worried about Christians taking over the country because they don't listen to us. Christians don't listen to their pastors. I'm thinking like they're, nothing personal. You guys are great. I meant other churches, not you all. But you understand that we are such an anti-authoritarian, individualistic society. But the trouble is, that breaks. And when that breaks, you look for mama, right? You go back.
Yeah. This is that anodyne thing.
Or
You go back to the more base
Or
religion.
you look for daddy. You look for the person, yeah.
Well,
And that's
there's
problematic.
economic, distress
Sure.
and climate distress and all
Distress,
kinds of other
distress. Yeah. No, we're a very anxious age, yeah.
Yeah, but to touch on some of that, the notion of that, the unity we talked about that no longer exists, and when you break down into your tribes, it goes the fear,
Right.
the fear of other, and that has just been
Right.
played out so much now.
Because when I sit there, I go, Christian nationalism is bad because as a gay person, Christian nationalists give me a good cause to fear. Like it's something to be afraid of. We can maybe flip that around and try to understand why my living authentically is something that terrifies them, but
Right.
that doesn't help.
Yeah, and I want to argue that again, this is one of the most Christian values, I think, is tolerance. Because the idea is God and I'm not. So there's a sense with the inherent limitation of my knowledge should make me humble when it comes to, but humility should lead to a kind of tolerance.
Yeah. But now we're back to the Sermon on the Mount again, Bill. And Christian nationalism has a tendency
Who said that? Where's that from? Sermon on the Mount?
The Sermon on the Mount? Yeah, exactly.
No, but I do think, no.
It's a little woke, okay? I mean, I heard about it, and it's like, and how big was the mountain anyway, okay? Trump would have, by the way, if Trump was Messiah, I would have risen in like 2 days, okay? And why do we need Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl? We have like a Christian bunny, okay? The Easter bunny and the eggs, all right? No Bad Bunny.
Right. Yes. Yeah. We are high art. We really do shoot that. And I think it's interesting, though. I do think the contradictions that people want. Because I think the vast majority of people, they say, we want to be more Christian, but we want separation of church and state. That was strong, very strong.
Because if I defined that as Christ-like, I want this country to be more like Jesus, as I understand Jesus to be. But that's not what we mean by Christian.
But if we can parse some of this out with people, a good friend of mine used to say that we're part of the radical fringe middle, right? And really, because the margins have become the center now, and that's very problematic.
This is Bill's best quote of the year.
That's my quote of the year here, so yeah. But I think if we can, instead of just reacting to someone, find out, well, what do you really mean when you want a traditional, in other words, and we may find it, not everybody, but we may find, 63% of the population, we kind of agree on commonality and we agree on decency. Now, again, as a Christian, that's not church, but that's certainly the kind of society I want that all people could thrive in, right? And so there's a sense was as a Christian, I want to see that happen in society, and I want I want people who disagree with me to be able to be protected in their disagreements, just like I would like that as well.
Yeah, and there's something too that G.K. Chesterton says something to the effect in Orthodoxy. He says, "See, the pre-modern person was wiser because they would rather take two truths in tension than settle for a half-truth." And I think part of what it would mean to sort of have a more religious country that was seeped in the biblical tradition is you see this in the entire biblical tradition, right? Whether it's the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, it's a polyvalent witness, right? I mean, you've got prophets and laws and things that are seemingly in tension, right? And you've got rabbis and theologians in the Christian church everything, trying to say, well, these are, yeah, there's this voice and there's this voice, and really, what you got to hear all this stuff dialectically, and that capacity, right, in the Western tradition, to think dialectically, to see that the truth is always dialogical, and it will often, and often the dialectic, it doesn't. There's this kind of poor person's way to read Hegel, as if the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. No. It's thesis, antithesis, and new tensions that arise out of what you hear in them. And so but then even the way, the prejudicial way we see things, right, like as contradictions versus tensions, right, and things like this. So if we're formed in a sacred text that begins to see polyvalence and tension as not problematic, but the truth is probably, there's a doubt. Where's the truth here? As opposed to something that's the anodyne, right? No,
right.
give me the blanket, right? That would be that would go a long way, I think, to sanctifying the culture.
Right, and I think maybe, so we need new persuasive words.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Rabbi.
there we go.
So maybe a closing metaphor, and I learned this from Rabbi Shefa Gold, who's a musician as a rabbi, and she made the point that in a string instrument, it's the tension in the string that causes the music. The tension causes the music.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you for coming to the north.
Yeah, this is like Game of Thrones.
Yeah,
For you fans.
Game of
I feel like I'm past the wall right now. I need to layer up.
Yeah, the North remembers. All right, so thank you all for coming. Thank you all who were listening, and
Thanks for coming out.
thank you, Jeanette. Support local Jeanette. So please have refreshments. Hang around for more conversation. Thank you.